Well, hello, folks, and welcome once again to another Flock Talk. Nice to have you along with us. This should be a little bit of a shorter one. I recently received a question, and the question had to do with Christ's comments there in Matthew 22, render to Caesar, therefore, the things that are Caesar's, and to God, the things that are God's. And the question comes up, well, isn't it all God's? So what does that look like? So I want to comment on that a little bit. First of all, I want to go briefly through the passage. Now, don't forget that this is one of those passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You remember John is very different from the other three Gospels that called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they often cover similar things. We always want to pay attention, though, if the three Gospels cover the same thing. And this is one of those occasions where all three Gospels cover this event where Christ is asked about paying taxes. Oftentimes, and I know I do, I generally go to Matthew because we don't have time to look at the others, but let's just quickly go to Matthew and see and talk about this. Matthew 22:15, then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. So, we often go to this passage to talk about taxes. Let's remember that it's not really about taxes here. It's about entangling Christ. It's about getting something against him. Now, we know this in the next verse. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians. Now, this is interesting. Christ is up against the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, a lot of things here, I'll just touch on them quickly. The Pharisees are plotting how they might entangle him, but they're pretty smart. They don't go themselves because they don't want to get shown up. They don't want to lose the argument. So they get their disciples, they get their little sidekicks or whatever you want to call them. They'll go. And so if they get, if they kind of in a win-win situation, like what politicians like to do. If they win the argument against Christ, well, it's their disciples. If they lose the argument, well, it was just our disciples. So, it's not a perfect world. Our disciples weren't up to snuff. So we know how shameless they're actually being here. It's not actually about paying taxes. It's about trying to entangle Christ in his talk, just like Matthew says in verse 15 of Matthew 22. They butter him up. They say, we know you're true. You teach the way of God in truth. You do not care about anyone. You do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And so they have Christ in what they believe is on the horns of a dilemma. If he says, don't pay taxes to Caesar, the Herodians are going to be upset. If he says, do pay taxes to Caesar, the disciples of the Pharisees, they're going to get that around and say, this guy, he wants you to pay taxes to Caesar. This is not your Messiah here. No Messiah would ever say that. So what Christ does, of course, here is he says, Matthew tells us he perceived their wickedness. These are wicked people asking a question. And why are they wicked? Because they're being two-faced, if you will. They're asking a question, but they don't care about the answer at all. All they're trying to do is entrap someone. That's all they're trying to do. Jesus perceived their wickedness, verse 18, and said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Leaves no doubt as to what's going on here. And then he says, show me the tax money. They brought him a denarius, and he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And of course, the last verse in that section says, when they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Now, a couple things here, or one big thing. There are some people that say, well, since Caesar's inscription was on it, then he owns all the money. And since maybe we have a president's picture or something like that, or inscription, if you will, on our coins or on our bills, that means that that the state owns all our money, and they can take as much of it as they want. And I'm frankly amazed at such conclusions based on the obvious nature of this passage. Christ understands that Caesar's inscription is on it, And he doesn't say, well, therefore pay everything to Caesar or whatever he wants. Instead, he says the opposite. He says, pay to God what is God's. Now, God's inscription was not on the coin. So how can he say, pay to God what is God's if God's inscription is not on the coin? So it's crazy and foolish, frankly, to say, well, Caesar's inscription is on it. George Washington is on our quarters, and Ben Franklin is on our $100 bills or whatever. It all belongs to the state. No, Christ clearly said, you can give this coin, or you should give this coin to God under certain conditions. I didn't say under certain conditions, but I said give to Caesar what Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Now we have some questions here. I know I've gone over this with some of you before, so I'll try to make this quick. First of all, what do we do if Caesar asks for what is God's? Secondly, who do we go to find out what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? Do we go to Caesar or do we go to God? Because Caesar just may ask for what is God's, and Caesar, we know, doesn't ask. He tells us, this is what you're going to pay. And what if Caesar is taking what actually belongs to God? Now, another question comes up here, and that is something like this. Well, what does it look like if it all belongs to God? Does that mean we put all of our money in the offering plate at church, or send it all to missionaries, or send it to the pastor? What does that look like? And for answer, I go back to the Garden of Eden. When the Garden of Eden was first introduced to Adam and Eve hadn't done anything. So, in other words, they had a property responsibility, at least, to the garden. They were supposed to tend and keep it, it says in Genesis. And God said to them, of any tree you may freely eat, but not of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, there we have a case where it was clearly all God's, but God had said, this is what you are allowed to do with it. You are allowed to use this property for your benefit. The same thing applies to money. We are allowed to use it for the benefit of ourselves and for our neighbor, not forgetting to give to God what is God's, but specifically, and giving to God's what is God's would involve something like a man providing for his family and paying for a roof over their head and for food in their stomachs, for example. That is actually giving to God what is God's, because we're using it in a way consistent with his revealed will, like what Adam and Eve were supposed to do in the Garden of Eden, and did not do, of course. Now, let's ask this question, because this is a question that everybody wants to ask. Well, maybe we'll start with a statement. Well, we don't know how much we owe to the state because the Bible doesn't really tell us, so I guess we just pay them whatever they ask or whatever they tell us. Well, what if they tell us, like they've done before, in some cases, what if they tell us to pay everything to them and our family starves? What if they ask for, again, what belongs to God? And that has happened in history. How do we know what we are actually owed to them? How do we know? Well, there is a way to find out. Remember this phrase, this is from Matthew 22:21, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Render therefore. Two Greek words there that we're going to run into again. And where are we going to run into them? In a lot of people's favorite passage when it comes to this kind of stuff, Romans 13. Paul says this, for this cause pay ye taxes. This is Romans 13:6. He just got done talking about let every soul be subject to the higher powers and so forth. And let's go back to verse 4. For he is the minister, talking about the civil magistrate of God. The word there is diakonos. He's the deacon of God. To thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain. Talk about the sword here. We're talking about capital punishment here. We're talking about the punishment of evil doers here. We're not talking about paying money to send our neighbor's child to school or paying money for social security so that they can give us some of it when we get old. We're not talking about paying money for the Department of Transportation or the Federal Trade Commission. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about paying money for the civil magistrate to use the sword. How do I know that? We'll read on. He is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon who? Upon the ones that don't pay their taxes? No, upon him that does evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. In other words, do the right thing. Well, what's the right thing? For in this cause pay ye tribute, also for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. What very thing? Vengeance against those who commit evil, and we're ultimately talking about here about capital punishment, the ultimate punishment. Render therefore, next verse, to all their dues. That word render therefore is the exact same language, the same two words that Matthew used back in Matthew 22. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now, when we say render therefore to all their due, we are saying we go to God to find out what we owe to Caesar and not to Caesar. Be clear on this. We pay taxes because God says to pay them, not because Caesar says to pay them. Our responsibility to pay taxes begins with God. And by the way, we don't have time to deal with this, but God never, in his word, gives the state the authority to collect taxes at the point of punishment. God said many things to Israel through his prophets and through Moses. I use this example all the time with Moses. We never see something like, and the Lord said unto Moses, speak unto the children of Israel that they pay taxes, and if they don't, this is what we're going to do to them. Never happens. And so we see, backing up to the idea of paying taxes, for this, and I ask the question, well, for what reason do we pay taxes? That's not a question that gets asked too much. And if it does get asked, it's like, well, the reason is because they say we should. That's not the reason that we just got here in Romans. For this cause pay ye tribute also, or paying taxes. What cause? To enable the civil magistrate to bear the sword. That's why we pay taxes. We have no other reason in the scriptures to pay taxes given to godly civil magistrates. Now we see the collection of taxes all throughout the scriptures at the point of a gun, shall we say, or at the point of the sword, shall we say. But we see that either with pagan kings, or we see that with apostate kings in Israel. For example, Saul, very early on, began to enforce the collection of taxes. And we see that in 1 Samuel 8, where Samuel tells the people, this man Saul, or he didn't say Saul, but this king is going to take that which is yours. He will take your. And he goes and he says he will take your, he will take your, he will take your. And he says that about 10 or 12 times. So we see the forcible collection, first of all, with a godless king. Now, when it comes to taxes, though, we can't forget about this point here, and I want to emphasize this as we wrap this up here. Why does the state want our tax money? Is it because the state is really involved and really, shall we say, all about definitely making sure that, we have to pay taxes to have a nice civil society around here? So I have to ask, can we have a civil society? Can we have production without taxes? We have, for example, Department of Agriculture. Were people, raising, farming their land and raising animals and exchanging food and taking them to the farmer's market before we had a Department of Agriculture? I mean, did the Department of Agriculture create the farms? No, not at all. And I myself would love to see how farming would look like without a Department of Agriculture, quite frankly. And there's all kinds of departments that we haven't always had in the history of our country, but somehow we had transportation, believe it or not, before we had a Department of Transportation. But let me go on here because there's a point that I really want to make. Why is it that the state is so big on collecting money? I believe a lot of it has to do with envy. I want you to hear this from Genesis chapter 26 and verses 12 and following. It says, "Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year an hundredfold." Not bad. 1 year, a hundredfold return. "And the Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and continued to go richer until he became very wealthy, for he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household." So he had money, he had possessions, he had a great household, so he had a lot of servants. Next phrase, "so that the Philistines envied him." Well, what did they do about it? Did they go to Isaac and say, "How did you get so wealthy?" This is what they did. It says, the next verse, "Now all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth." Envy is a horrible thing. It didn't help their flocks and herds that they stopped up Isaac's wells, but that was the next best thing, right? This guy's getting wealthy. We're envious. We can't steal his stuff. He's too powerful. So we're going to stop up his wells, and that'll fix him. Keep in mind, it didn't give the Philistines one more drop of water. Now you're going to say, "Oh, no. Our civil magistrates, they need money in order to serve us." Well, there's an awful lot of money that gets wasted, and if they were really interested in serving us, maybe they would consider just staying out of the way. I'll tell you how to really serve us. Look to the Word of God and start collecting taxes, no longer forcibly, and start doing your job to punish actual evildoers instead of people who are actually helping their neighbor and serving their neighbor and loving their neighbor, like Amos Miller, for example. They're punishing him. This is what we know about civil magistrates. If they will not punish the evildoer, they will ultimately punish the righteous. And there's a lot of envy going on here, just like the Philistines. So in any case, wrapping up here, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. We go to God to find out what is Caesar's, and we find out what belongs to Caesar in Romans 13, where Paul clearly says, this is the reason why we pay taxes. So it's not a mystery. We don't have to just step back and throw up our hands and say, "Well, I don't know why we pay taxes, but they come and tell us we got to pay, so we'll pay whatever they want us to pay." They charge us at the, they have the guns. They have the power to take our property. They have the power to throw us in jail. And that has been done. So I would have to say that if in our present situation, why do we pay taxes? For this cause you pay taxes. What is that cause? Well, for our cause, it's because if we don't pay, we're going to get in much, much bigger trouble. If we don't pay, for example, property taxes, they'll come and take my property. So I would say for this cause, we pay taxes so that we can hang on to the amount of property that they're allowing us to hang on to. So that is the quick illustration, of the quick flock talk on taxes. Again, the question of, actually, it's more not the question so much of taxes, but what does it look like since it all does belong to God? And it all does belong to God. We utilize in the way He tells us for our good, and we pay taxes so that the magistrate can effectively utilize up to and including capital punishment in order for us to have a just society. And you can't have a just society without the civil magistrate punishing that which is evil. And God does not give the civil magistrate any other authority other than Romans 13. Well, it's talked about in other areas, but clearly the authority to punish evil is given in Romans 13, and that's the reason why we pay taxes, So, in other words, we are actually giving to God what is God's. When we pay the civil magistrate to punish evil, we are using the money that God has given us consistent with what He's told us. So that's the ultimate answer. Yes, we give to God what is God's. What that means is we use the resources, the money He's given to us, in a way consistent with what He has told us in His Word. Well, I thank you very much for sticking with me so far, as always. Thank you for coming along with me today on Flock Talk. I know we started out saying it's going to be 5 minutes. Lately, they all seem to be 20. We'll do our best to keep it to 20 minutes. And again, it's just great to have you along with me here today. And trust we'll see you soon again. Thank you.